I'm joined today by Mercedes Carrera, adult film actress, engineer, gamer, and free speech advocate. Mercedes, it's great to have you on. I have so much to ask you about, but I think a good place to start is kind of what's making news now, which is that some donations that you intended to make to a group called Able Gamers have been turned down by the organization. So let's go to the very beginning. First off, what is Able Gamers?
Okay, great. So Able Gamers is a charity in the US that provides support to disabled gamers through classes and workshops and technology and things like that.
Okay, and how
Mhm.
did you come up with the idea to do a fundraiser and to donate the money to Able Gamers?
Okay, so the fundraiser, the idea for it actually existed prior to Able Gamers' involvement. We had this idea to do a live webcam show for charity, and this was not related to Gamergate. This is just something that was happening independently. And this we'd had conversations about this going back about a month and a half. So once we solidified the web platform that we were going to present this over, and we're talking an adult content show, it was brought to me by the coordinators and the organizers, hey, here are 3 or 4 different charity options. And one of them was Able Gamers. And I've met some wonderful disabled gamers in my involvement with Gamergate and also just online. And I thought it would be a great cause to give money to, and there were several great ones. So what happened was I let the coordinators take the lead. I'm pretty busy. So there were email communications, and I said, "Hey, make sure that they know that this is a pornography event. This is adult content, et cetera, et cetera." Because in my mind, that was the most important thing. Pornography is always the is always the top issue. And evidently, Able Gamer said, "Yeah, that's fine. We've accepted involvement from people in the adult industry before, no problem." At the same time, there was a thread going on Reddit that made somebody made a comment. Somebody unrelated to the event made the comment. They're weaponizing porn. They're weaponizing charity. Unfortunately, somebody sent that link to Able Gamers, and they perceived it as though they were being used as a pawn or in some way used for a Gamergate agenda.
Okay, so let's pause there.
Okay.
You said that you're asserting that Able Gamers perceive that in a particular way. What are you basing that on? Because the only statement I found from Able Gamers
Uh-huh.
says that they are 100% neutral with regard to Gamergate and that was not a factor.
Right, right. So their issue with it wasn't per se Gamergate, the the political controversy.
Yeah.
Their issue with it was the comment about about that this event was weaponizing porn and weaponizing charity, and that was conflated with Gamergate. So they were concerned that they would be perceived as having a political side by their involvement in this.
Okay, so
Now,
to be clear, what you're saying is not that Able Gamers was concerned that you were associated with the pro Gamergate side, but rather that they were worried that by accepting the donation, they would be associated with the pro Gamergate side.
yes, well, I don't I'm not them, so I can't speak for them.
But that's your
However,
understanding of it.
my understanding of it based on the email that they sent was that, yes, they were concerned because the perception on this Reddit thread was that because I've been an outspoken supporter of Gamergate, that the event was conflated with Gamergate and that they would be perceived as having been part of some ploy to weaponize pornography. Does that
Okay,
make
and
sense?
and that does make sense. And as
Okay.
again from the quote I have, it seems that Able Gamers said they felt the organizers of this event. Now, organizers could mean you or the people that were working with you on the logistics. I don't know for sure, but that
Mhm.
the organizers of the event, quote, had not been forthcoming with the details of the event. What specific details are they referring to?
Well, now, and I'm 100% responsible for this.
Okay.
I was not emailing with Able Gamers. The coordinators of the event were. However, I'm responsible for it because I specifically said to the organizers, please let them know about my involvement in the adult industry. Now, in my mind, that was the most important issue. I didn't even think about Gamergate. I hadn't realized that it was so controversial, to be honest. So, they didn't mention Gamergate because this was not intended to be a Gamergate sanctioned event. And I did not tell the organizers, make sure to let them know that Mercedes Carrera is a Gamergate supporter. So, while the organizers did not mention it in the email, that was my fault. And it was my fault because I didn't specify that that needed to happen. Additionally, the event is not sanctioned by Gamergate, but because I have been very outspoken in my support, it's not surprising that it got conflated, especially in a place like Twitter.
Yeah, and it's
Around,
interesting because there's kind of a few underlying issues here, and I want to get in a second to your involvement with Gamergate. But there is this other thing, and I interviewed former adult film actor Dave Pounder recently about the issue of people being fired from jobs for at some point having been involved in adult film, and the fact
right.
that if that involvement in the film was a legal job, that it's really imposing morality on hiring, and you're kind of going down what can be a pretty dangerous slippery slope, aren't you?
Right, exactly. Well, and yeah, yes, this is the type of discrimination that those of us who are in the adult industry face regularly.
And
So,
and of course then you have this kind of blurred line, which is, well, okay, what if someone was in a particularly graphic rated R movie, or it was NC-17, but it was what would be considered a Hollywood movie? Where do you draw the line? And of course the allegations are not that the companies are doing anything illegal by these policies, but
right.
more that they're policies that really open themselves up to a lot of subjectivity, and that can really be an issue. But to talk about your involvement with Gamergate, so how did you characterize yourself as a strong supporter of Gamergate? How did you end up designating yourself that way?
Well, I've said that I'm an outspoken supporter of Gamergate, and what my I had been watching Gamergate, and it has evolved as a consumer revolt. That's the best way that I can really describe it. And there are multitudes of types of people under that hashtag right now. My background was in engineering and technology. So I keep up with tech issues. And also being in the adult film industry now, I keep up with free speech, censorship, all of that. I'm very interested in this because I see an alarming social trend.
And you've talked about net neutrality as well, where you come down
I
really
have.
with what is more traditionally kind of like the progressive point of view on that we should not have internet fast lanes, we should have openness on the internet, etc.
Right, right. Because my concern with net neutrality, not a concern with net neutrality, but the absence of it, would be that you would have larger companies and wealthier organizations able to hijack the internet, and that will kill innovation and creativity, and that's my concern. So with Gamergate, and I've had multitudes of conversations about the genesis of it. Obviously, we can go back to the beginning and then talk about what spurred all of this. But when I got involved was when I started to see these anti-sex radical feminists get involved and say, yes, we need to censor video games. These are dangerous. We speak for all women when we say that this is offensive, et cetera, et cetera. And, really, they don't speak for me. Absolutely not. So that was when I started to say things about it. And due to the nature of just being in porn, I got a lot of attention for it very quickly in the Gamergate world because I'm not hiding behind an anonymous avatar.
Yeah, and I think that there's some conflation that's happening with regard to, because this kind of abstract claim of misogyny is kind of out there in the ether with regard to Gamergate, and
Hmm.
with regard to pornography as well, and we can talk about
Right.
the connections there. There's been a kind of split between, I guess, what are self-described as sex positive feminists,
Hmm.
and those who don't describe themselves that way, and they
Right.
they may have varying views, right? So it may be unfair even to say that one particular side is simply anti-sex. We probably need more nuance than that.
Absolutely. I mean, we're talking about spectrums anytime we talk about groups of people. And what actually that's part of the reason I spoke out on Gamergate was because even though, yes, there's definitely an us versus them mentality probably on both sides of that hashtag.
Yeah.
However, what I noticed specifically on the anti-Gamergate side was this tendency to just smear the entire Gamergate movement as misogynistic males and neck-bearded shitlords and all of these things. And as a woman who worked in STEM, I worked in engineering for 7 years and then my schooling as well. Um, I had a real problem with that because I don't think that that's the way to further gender relations.
No, it's
First,
not. But at the same time, I'm sure you would agree that the allegations, the kind of haphazard umbrella allegations that you see coming from pro Gamergate to anti of, social justice warrior as an ad hominem, et cetera, that's equally unproductive, right?
absolutely, and I think really I'm guilty of that too, because especially on Twitter, you're limited to 140 characters. So I think what happens is labels get attached and they get utilized as a means of communication when there really is more nuance and there's more variability in the meanings and the definitions of that. Um, so yes, and I've faced quite a bit of slut shaming and attacks from the anti Gamergate side. So ironically, the people who claim to be the most progressive also, I mean, I've heard consistently that I am, I've internalized misogyny and all of these things, and that's what happens when you speak out on anything.
Well, let's dig
There,
into that a little bit because this is interesting
sure,
to me. As someone who's
sure,
in the adult film industry,
uh-huh.
let's get first your reaction to the kind of broadest claim that is sometimes made about your industry, which is that it is by its very nature a misogynistic industry. Let's just start there to see kind of what you think, and then I have a few questions about that.
Sure. Well, um, it's very interesting that people who have never been in an industry decide to paint it and smear it and create some story around it when they're not intimately involved. When I worked in STEM, I was paid per my pay grade and my education and experience, which means that for the most part, I was paid the same as everybody else, regardless of gender and my pay grade. In the adult industry, female performers make 2 to 3 times what the male performers make per scene. Additionally, there is a tremendous amount of there are many, many very competent females in the adult industry, some performers, some producers, but it's actually a very female positive industry when you're inside of it. Uh, so it's interesting that sometimes these critiques come from people who really don't know much about what they're critiquing.
But you wouldn't argue that nobody from outside an industry can gain reasonable knowledge about that industry, right? That's not your claim.
Well, there's a difference between somebody who is a well informed journalist and is intimately involved in an industry. For example, I write articles for a website called The Real Porn WikiLeaks, and several of their journalists are not involved in the adult industry but are intimately a part of it as journalists. Now, their take on issues is well informed. However, somebody who's sitting in there is an armchair journalist or an armchair sociologist sitting at home making claims or assertions about what they perceive to be something without knowing it intimately.
Right.
I
So
really
you're
don't think a lot
referring
of
to some
people do.
specific cases, but you're not arguing this is the same argument that people who have never been to war cannot possibly comment about a country's foreign policy, which I think is a crazy argument.
Oh, of course. Well, and when you talk about something like war, you're also not just talking about war and the battle itself, but also uh, the way societies are affected by war. So there's a big difference between something like the pornography industry is misogynistic to
Well,
the
what if
performers in
you're
it.
but what if you're talking about how society is influenced by pornography? It would be kind of the same thing.
Well, what's interesting about that is they've done studies, and I've cited them in recent articles that I've written that actually show a causation link between online pornography and decrease of sexual violence. Now, the hypothesis is that when people have a psychological outlet for their violent sexual urges, they're less likely to act them out in the world. So, interestingly, it may actually be the opposite.
I have
And
seen that study, yeah. But
yeah,
so, I a lot of times, and I've had several guests on over the years to discuss either sex work or pornography, which are two totally different things, and I'm not implying that they are the same thing.
hmm
And sometimes I think that the debate that goes on is maybe not the most productive debate, which is just a debate over whether the industry is or is not misogynistic. And you hear arguments from one side that are similar to
right.
the ones you've presented, and then you hear arguments from the other side. I think that if you look at the data, you see that in spite of the fact that what you've said is correct, women are paid multiple times more than men in the industry, etc. You
Mhm.
do have an industry where the financing is disproportionately coming from men, and the content is disproportionately produced for men. And yes, women are paid more for their role within that kind of male funded and
Mhm.
male consumed industry.
Mhm.
However, I think that if everybody were able to agree on that, we could say, well, maybe some level of objectification of women is okay. We just need to contextualize it within society and analyze what effect it's having. And I actually had a professor in college, and I still remember this, who described himself as a strong feminist,
Mhm.
who said the conversations over whether A or B is misogynistic or objectifies women are
Mhm.
less relevant or productive than conversations about, okay, we have media that to different degrees does objectify women.
Mhm.
How is that damaging to society, and what level of that is okay? I feel like that would
Right.
be a much more nuanced and productive debate to be having.
Absolutely. And, it's not just women. Let's talk about men also. If you look at hero movies, or even an alarming trend in modern media right now, is not to necessarily portray men as heroes, but as dunces. Now, if we create tropes in that format, and we create objectifications for men in that way, that can be equally damaging. However, that's not the conversation that's being had, because, like you said, as soon as the words objectification and misogyny are used, it's assumed that those words have a negative framework. So again, we need to step out. Everything is objectification in
Yeah,
one way
there's
or
been
another.
objectification of women based on gender long before there was modern pornography. But then I think the more important thing is let's connect that to whether pornography is creating unrealistic expectations within people's relationships, and
Mhm.
what impact that is having long term on people's ability to be satisfied within the relationship. That's something that we can have a more substantive conversation about, I feel like. I don't
Mhm.
know if you agree.
Absolutely that. And if you notice, the pornography industry has actually addressed that. There's feminist porn now. There are so many shades of pornography. And, what's very interesting is, actually, I worked as a commercial print model for years and years, starting from when I was about 13. And I found the adult industry to be very body positive, which again is not something that you perceive when you're outside of it. But the actresses are not under the same kind of pressure, because there's really a demand for all different body types. So that's what I found to be interesting in the critique of the objectification of women within it, was that when you're inside of it, you find that that's actually very open. But objectification in society as a whole, at this point, we're talking archetypal studies. And that was what I maintained in the conversations about video games. These critiques of these female trope video game characters was really missing a lot in the conversation of all media, whether it's pornography or video games. Humans create archetypes. If you talk about Jungian theory and the studies around that, this is something that goes back for eons. It's the way that we psychologically project out into the world. So many of these video game characters are actually very well developed. Second level female archetypes, the heroines and mothers, or alternately the maiden archetype, if we're talking maiden, mother, crone. So I don't think that that's a bad thing. You go back to the Grimm's fairy tales, you also see archetypes. Are they tropes? Well, yeah, if we brought them to life, perhaps they would be. But they still have a purpose in storytelling for society.
So to kind of circle back to the beginning and wrap up, a few easy, simple questions. First of all, what's
Sure.
the status now as far as the charity show? Is there an
Uh-huh.
alternate charity that will be receiving the money?
Yes, well, the January 2nd live stream show is still happening and details will be forthcoming. However, we have entered into a partnership with the Fine Young Capitalist, and we will be creating a scholarship fund it's a merit based scholarship fund, so there's no restriction on gender or age or ethnicity. But it will be STEM oriented. So that's what we're creating with that.
And
And
we've had them on the program before.
oh, how wonderful. Yeah, they're just fantastic. And, we made them aware of all of the issues around this, and they were really fantastic. So, our prior issues with Able Gamers, they were aware of it. So there's that. Also this week, I've decided to donate. I do adult cam shows. So I'm donating the proceeds of my cam shows this week to a disabled gamer in the gaming community. He goes by the moniker Big Brain, and he's got terrible eyesight and vision, and the Organization for the Blind wouldn't give him a portable reader, and he's in his master's degree program for psychology, so he has a lot of textbooks. So unfortunately, they wouldn't purchase this for him because he has an old CRT at home. So I wanted to do something for disabled gamers. I actually there was another disabled gamer organization that also wouldn't take my funds, and so after that, I got a little disheartened. But then I said, well, that's fine. I will go direct and help somebody who needs it right now. And I will be creating my own 501c3. This week there were several other adult performers that were X'd out of charity events. So there's a need for it, and we want to give.
Okay, and then as far as, so people understand, how much money is at play here? In other words, what do you predict would be the amount of money that Able Gamers will have effectively turned down by refusing these forthcoming donations?
Well, it's hard to say because, we're talking a 2 to 3 hour webcam show. And however, the platform that we are going to be on will double our donation. So, it could be $500, it could be 5,000, it could be 15,000. I really don't know until we do it. It's our first time. So we've gotten a tremendous response, and I think a lot of people from the adult industry will tune in too. So hopefully it'll be a success.
All right, we've been speaking with Mercedes Carrera, adult film actress, engineer, gamer, free speech advocate. Thank you for being on today.
Thank you so much for having me.